I still remember the way she said it, like every word was a shard of ice. "We'd prefer if you left." That was Kate's voice, polished and sharp, cutting right through the music and laughter of that Christmas party in Westlake Hills. She stood there in her designer dress that shimmered under the chandelier like she had stepped off the cover of some glossy magazine, and she looked at me the way a person might glance at a stain on the carpet they can't quite scrub out. My hands were still rough and smudged from helping a stranger whose car had broken down on the slick December roads. My simple burgundy dress already wrinkled from sitting too long in my old sedan. I was 30 minutes late, chilled to the bone, and I had walked into that mansion expecting maybe a little grace, maybe even warmth. Instead, I walked straight into contempt, like my presence was a crime against their picture-perfect evening. But let me back up, because a story like this doesn't begin with a cold glare under a chandelier. It begins with me, Joan Harrington, 64 years old, sitting alone in my small apartment in St. Paul, Minnesota. It begins with a life that had shrunk after my husband Arthur died 5 years back, leaving me with enough to scrape by, but not enough to feel alive. I stretched my pension like a rubber band that might snap at any moment, clipping coupons, fixing my own hair, shopping at thrift stores that smelled faintly of mothballs and dust. I kept my head down, but inside I carried this ache, this quiet craving to still be part of something bigger. Something family. When my son Mike called me one evening, his voice careful like he was tiptoeing over glass, and told me, "Mom, Kate's family wants to meet you, really meet you this time." I felt my heart jump and hesitate at the same time. He explained that the Prescott family was throwing their grand annual Christmas party, the kind that people in Austin whispered about because of the guest list alone. And apparently, they had asked for me. I should have been thrilled. I should have been dancing around my kitchen. But after 3 years of marriage, Kate had barely looked me in the eye, much less opened her heart. Her parents, Beth and Charles, were practically Texas aristocracy, old money, old traditions, old rules about who was worthy and who wasn't. And then there was her grandmother, Rose Montgomery, a woman who, I'd been told, had once built an empire but who rarely spoke at family gatherings, watching everything with those piercing eyes that saw through you. Every dinner I had attended with them felt like being seated at the kids' table, except this one came with crystal glasses and conversations about investments, golf clubs, and European vacations I couldn't even spell. So when Mike told me I should maybe dress nicely, you know how they are about appearances, I laughed, but it wasn't from humor. It was from nerves. I knew exactly how they were about appearances. Polished hair, tailored clothes, manicured lives where even smiles looked rehearsed. I had never belonged in their world. I cut my own hair in front of the bathroom mirror with drugstore scissors and wore shoes until the soles practically gave way. But this invitation felt like a test, maybe even a door opening if I dared to walk through it. My chance, I told myself, my last chance to show them that I wasn't some embarrassment Mike had to keep at arm's length. So I said yes, not knowing that on my way to Westlake Hills, I would stop for a stranger on the roadside, and, by doing so, expose exactly what Kate's family really thought of women like me. When Mike first brought Kate into my life, I knew right away she belonged to a different universe than the one I had spent my whole life in. She came from Polish and privilege, and I came from hand-me-down furniture and the constant sound of neighbors arguing through thin apartment walls. The first time she stepped into my place in St. Paul, she glanced around at my worn couch with the floral print I had picked up at a church sale, the old refrigerator that rattled like it had asthma, and the chipped kitchen table that still held the marks of Mike's homework from grade school. She smiled politely and said, "It's very cozy." But the way she said cozy made it sound like the worst insult she could think of without being openly cruel. I tried. I really did. I cooked her chicken casserole the way Arthur used to love it. I asked her questions about her job, her plans, her family, and I listened carefully like her words mattered. But no matter what I did, I could feel it in her eyes. She had already decided who I was. I wasn't Joan. I was just Mike's poor mother, the woman who didn't belong in her story. I told myself maybe the wedding would change things, that once we were family, the walls would come down a little. But the Prescott wedding wasn't like anything I had ever seen before. It was held at their estate in Westlake Hills, the kind of place people in Minnesota only see in magazines, with sweeping driveways, white-gloved servers, and chandeliers taller than my entire living room. That wedding must have cost more than I had earned in the past 5 years combined. And there I was in my best navy dress, the one I had worn at Arthur's funeral. I tried to press it out smooth and hide the fading at the seams, but next to the sequins and silks swirling around me, I felt like a sparrow lost in a garden of peacocks. I smiled too much, I spoke too little, and the entire evening I carried that gnawing feeling that everyone could see exactly how out of place I was. Kate's mother, Beth Prescott, didn't make it easier. She introduced me not as Joan Harrington, not as the woman who raised the man her daughter loved, but as Mike's mother, from Saint. Paul no name, no identity of my own, just a location on a map and a relationship that made me sound like a distant cousin who had wandered in by mistake. People nodded politely, their eyes sliding past me as if I was a formality to be endured before they could return to conversations about business mergers, vacation homes, and political fundraisers. I kept sipping my champagne, which tasted bitter and too expensive at the same time, and told myself maybe this was just nerves, that once they got to know me, things would soften. But even as I thought it, I knew deep down, nothing about me fit into their carefully curated world. And yet, in that glittering chaos, one person caught my attention. Kate's grandmother, Rose Montgomery, stood quietly in the corner, not drawing attention but observing everything. She wasn't flashy like the rest, not dripping with jewels or competing for the loudest laugh. There was a sharpness in her blue eyes, a kind of awareness that told me nothing escaped her notice. She didn't chatter, she didn't perform, but I could feel her presence like a weight in the room. It struck me then that Kate might underestimate her, but Rose was no frail matriarch. She had the bearing of someone who had built something with her own 2 hands, someone who didn't need to announce her power because it spoke for itself. And while she didn't say a word to me that night, I couldn't shake the sense that she was measuring me, filing me away for reasons I couldn't begin to guess. I remember leaning toward Kate during the reception, trying to make conversation the way women do when we're still figuring each other out. I said something like, "Your grandmother seems very sharp." Kate's smile tightened, polite but cautious, and she answered, "Grandmother mostly keeps her opinions to herself now. She lets Dad handle the business decisions." The way she said "let's" stuck with me. It wasn't can't or doesn't, it was let's. And that single word carried a weight I couldn't unpack at the time. I tucked it away in the back of my mind, telling myself family dynamics in wealthy circles must work differently than anything I'd ever known. They lived in a world where power had its own language, and I didn't speak it. After the wedding, Mike and Kate settled down near her parents in Westlake Hills. Suddenly, my son's life was being lived in manicured neighborhoods behind gated driveways, while mine was still measured in coupon books and creaky radiators back in St. Paul. Our visits became fewer, our phone calls shorter, and when they did happen, Mike's voice had that quality of translation, like he was trying to bridge 2 languages, mine filled with stories about neighbors and casseroles, theirs full of talk about charity galas and board meetings. Whenever I was invited to family dinners, I found myself at the far end of the table, smiling too hard at jokes I didn't quite get, holding my fork like a prop, trying to look less out of place than I felt. Those dinners were like watching a play I hadn't auditioned for. Conversations orbited around business deals that sounded like code words, updates on the country club's expansion, and vacations in Paris or Lake Como that felt like postcards from another planet. I sat there nodding, pretending to follow, but inside, I was shrinking, aware that nothing I could offer would land in that world. I thought maybe I could connect if I leaned into their interests. Mike gently suggested, "Mom, maybe talk to Beth about her garden club or ask Kate about her charity work." But every time I tried, it felt like knocking on a door that had already been locked from the inside. Beth gave me curt, pleasant answers. Kate smiled with that polite distance, and the message was clear. I wasn't expected to step further in. Still, I noticed Mike trying, like a man caught in the middle of a tug of war, pulling one way toward me, the other toward them. He wanted me to belong. I could feel it. But he was tired, worn down by Kate's subtle campaign to keep me at arm's length. It wasn't outright cruelty, never anything you could point to and say, "There, that's unkind." It was a series of small cuts, seating me at the far end of the table, never including me in their chatter, treating my stories like background noise. By the time dessert came, I always felt like a prop they brought out because it was expected, not because anyone truly wanted me there. And walking back to my car afterward, under the glow of their endless Christmas lights or the hum of cicadas in summer, I would wonder how my son could live in two worlds at once, and how long before I would disappear from one of them entirely. When Mike first called about the Christmas party invitation, I almost dropped the phone. For a second, I thought I had misheard him, because after 3 years of being politely ignored, suddenly I was not only invited, but apparently requested. I remember sitting at my small kitchen table in St. Paul, staring at the faded floral tablecloth, trying to picture myself inside that Prescott mansion, all glass and stone and dripping lights. A tiny spark of hope lit up inside me, the kind of hope you don't want to name out loud because it feels fragile. Maybe, I thought, Kate was ready to finally see me as part of their world. Or maybe it was Rose, the grandmother with the watchful eyes, nudging the family towards something like inclusion. Looking back, I should have known better than to believe it was acceptance, but hope has a way of making you blind. That whole week, I moved as if I were preparing for a test I had been failing for years. It wasn't just a party. It was my chance to prove I wasn't some shabby footnote in my son's life story. I spent 2 days combing through racks at Nordstrom Rack, sweating under the fluorescent lights as I held up gowns that looked glamorous on the hanger, but ridiculous against my pale skin in the mirror. A saleswoman named Tanya took pity on me. She had kind eyes and spoke softly, the way people do when they see you're in over your head but trying anyway. I told her, I want to fit in at a very formal Christmas party, the kind where everyone has money and judges you on sight. She didn't flinch. She pulled out a burgundy dress with delicate beading, originally $200 but now marked down to $65. When I slipped it on, something in me shifted. It wasn't couture, but it didn't scream thrift store either. For a moment, under the harsh lights of the dressing room, I saw a version of myself who might just belong. I bought matching shoes that pinched at the toes and a small clutch that felt more ornamental than practical, but for once I didn't care. I brought them home and laid them out on the bed like treasures. I even practiced standing in front of the mirror, smoothing the fabric, tucking a stray hair behind my ear, whispering lines of polite conversation under my breath. Still, there was a tremor in me I couldn't quiet. That week, Mike called twice. His tone carried the same tension it always did when my name collided with Kate's world. "Mom, remember, the Prescotts are traditional." Conservative conversation. Maybe steer clear of politics or, anything controversial. I bristled, telling him I'd been navigating dinner tables long before he was born. But he hesitated, and that silence told me the truth. This wasn't just about conversation. This was about me not embarrassing them. And so, while I practiced small talk in the mirror, a heavier weight pressed on me. It wasn't just about showing up in the right dress or remembering which fork to use. It was about being tested, about standing in front of a family who had already decided I didn't measure up and daring them to change their minds. Mike's last words haunted me. "Kate's stressed? Everyone will be there, her whole family, her father's associates. She just wants it to go smoothly, I thought. like I was the wrinkle threatening to ruin the whole fabric. I nodded into the phone even though he couldn't see me, swallowed my pride, and promised myself I would not be the source of shame. What I didn't realize then was that life had its own plans, and no amount of practice in front of a mirror was going to prepare me for what waited on that icy Texas road. The night before the party, I stood in front of the mirror in my little St. Paul apartment and practiced the way other people practice speeches. I rehearsed polite answers to questions about my work history, tried out lighthearted ways to explain why I still lived in a cramped 2-bedroom with radiators that hissed all night, and forced myself to sound curious about topics I knew nothing about: golf memberships, summer homes, European art shows. I felt like an actress memorizing lines for a role I wasn't sure I could pull off. My cat, Pepper, sat on the dresser watching me, tilting his head as though even he knew I was trying too hard. The silence pressed in, so I picked up the phone and called my neighbor, Mrs. Chen, to ask if she could look in on him while I was away. Mrs. Chen had lived down the hall for decades, a tiny woman with a big laugh who'd moved from Taiwan 40 years ago and carved out a life in Minnesota, one determined step at a time. When I told her where I was going, she chuckled softly and said, "Big family party?" Her eyes were kind, knowing. I nodded and whispered, "The biggest." My son's in-laws are very wealthy, very proper. This is my chance to finally be part of their family. She reached across the table and squeezed my hand, her palm warm and steady. "Joan, just be yourself. If they don't see your worth, that's their loss." I smiled, but inside I thought, being myself hasn't worked for 3 years. Maybe tomorrow I need to be the version of me they want to see. Her words lingered, though, mixing with my doubts in the quiet of the apartment. I laid out the burgundy dress on the bed like it was some sacred garment, smoothing the fabric again and again as though I could iron out not just the wrinkles, but the fear clinging to me. I double-checked my purse, my shoes, even the small jar of foundation I rarely wore, determined to cover every line that betrayed my age. I set my alarm for 8 a.m. sharp. Plenty of time, I thought. A hair appointment at 10, a final fitting at noon, and then I'd glide into Westlake Hills right at 2:15, fashionably on time. I told myself that if I could just get through the day, if I could just stand tall and smile gracefully, then maybe, just maybe, the Prescotts would look at me and see not a burden, not an outsider, but someone worthy of being tied to their name. When I finally slipped into bed, I lay awake longer than I admitted to myself, staring at the ceiling, the radiator humming like a lullaby in the corner. In my head, I replayed the moment I'd walk into that mansion. Imagine the surprise flickering across Kate's face when she saw me looking elegant and polished. Imagine Beth nodding with cautious approval, and even dared to picture Rose Montgomery turning those sharp eyes on me with genuine interest. I drifted off, holding that picture like a fragile ornament. Joan Harrington, no longer the embarrassing mother, but a woman who belonged in the room. I had no idea how cruelly reality would test that fragile dream. I should have known better than to trust December weather, but hope has a way of making you careless. That Saturday morning, I woke to the sound of ice hammering against the windows, like handfuls of gravel being thrown by an impatient hand. The sky was the color of steel, the kind that makes you shiver before you even step outside. My phone buzzed with a weather alert: freezing rain, hazardous roads, travel not advised. I sat on the edge of my bed in my robe, staring at it, half expecting the universe to give me a free pass, an excuse to bow out gracefully. But instead, everything began to unravel, piece by piece. The salon canceled my hair appointment because the power had gone out. The seamstress called to say her street had flooded and she couldn't finish with my dress adjustments. By noon, I was still in my robe, watching from the window as every tree branch grew heavy with glassy ice, wondering whether the Prescotts would cancel the party or carry on without a second thought. Around 12:30, the phone rang again. It was Mike. His voice was tight, cautious. "Mom, are you still planning to come?" "The roads are bad," I could hear Kate in the background, her voice sharp and clipped. "Tell her the party's still on." "Everyone's already here." That last part stung more than it should have. Everyone was there except me, the one person climbing uphill just to prove I belonged. I swallowed the lump in my throat and forced cheer into my words. "I'll be there." I wouldn't miss it. When I hung up, the silence in the apartment felt louder than before, and for a moment I just sat there, listening to the radiator hiss, asking myself who exactly I was doing this for, me or them. There wasn't time to dwell. With no stylist, no fancy blowout, it was just me and my bathroom mirror. I fumbled with the curling iron like it was a foreign tool, burned one finger, cursed under my breath, then tried again until the strands fell into something resembling order. My hands shook as I traced lipstick across my lips. Not from age, I insisted, but from nerves. I kept whispering it like a mantra. This is nerves, not age. When I finally stepped back from the mirror, the burgundy dress clung the way it had in the store, catching the light in small glimmers. For a heartbeat, I didn't see the widowed woman scraping by in Saint Paul. I saw a woman who might walk confidently into a Prescott Christmas party and not be dismissed. That flash of elegance was almost enough to steady me. But then my eyes shifted to the coat hanging by the door. It was the same puffy winter coat I had worn for years, sturdy and practical, with a zipper that stuck halfway up and cuffs frayed at the edges. There was no fur trim, no polished wool, no hint of glamour, just warmth and survival. Against the burgundy dress and pinching shoes, it looked like a cruel joke. I pulled it off the hook anyway because I didn't have another option. As I slipped my arms into the sleeves, I told myself that the dress would be what people saw once I arrived. The coat was just the necessary armor to get me there. Still, a voice deep down whispered what I didn't want to hear, that no matter how carefully I tried, I would always walk into their world with the evidence of mine clinging to me like ice. I pulled out of my apartment lot around 1:30, gripping the wheel like it was a lifeline. I had left early, giving myself more time than I thought I'd need because the roads looked like sheets of glass. The tires hissed against the ice. Every turn a slow negotiation between me and the frozen pavement. Other cars crawled along too, headlights glowing weak and yellow through the sleet, like we were all part of some reluctant parade. For a while I thought, I can do this. Just keep steady, keep calm, don't think about the clock. I counted the minutes as the wipers squealed across the windshield, reminding myself that arriving late was better than not arriving at all. But then, as I turned onto the winding road that curved toward the Prescott estate, I spotted her. An older woman standing beside a sleek luxury sedan, the hood propped open, steam curling into the icy air. She wore a beautiful coat, clearly expensive, but no hat, and ice clung stubbornly to her silver hair. For half a second, my instinct was to keep driving. The practical voice in my head whispered, "Call AAA, keep going, you're already late. Don't ruin this chance over a stranger." My knuckles tightened on the wheel, but another part of me pushed harder, the part that remembered all the times Arthur had stopped to help someone on the side of the road no matter what. I couldn't just leave her there in the storm, no more than I could ignore my own reflection. I slowed, pulled over carefully, and rolled down the window. The cold slapped me across the face as I leaned out. "Do you need help?" I called. The woman turned her head, and that was when I saw her clearly for the first time. She wasn't frail or panicked like I had imagined. She was composed, her expression firm, her presence almost regal. She must have been in her late 70s, but her features carried that undeniable beauty that doesn't fade. It just hardens into dignity. Her eyes icy blue, sharp and unyielding, met mine with such steadiness that I caught my breath. She spoke calmly, almost matter-of-factly. "My car won't start." The engine just died. For a heartbeat, I thought, "This is madness. You're standing here in heels that don't grip, wearing a dress you've guarded like glass, and you're about to crawl under the hood of a stranger's car in an ice storm." But then something about her presence, the way she stood so still, the way she didn't complain or shiver, hit me with a memory of my own mother. My mother had that same quiet resilience, that same unwillingness to let circumstances define her. And in that moment, it didn't matter that I was risking grease stains or that the Prescotts might be raising their crystal glasses without me. What mattered was that I couldn't be the kind of woman who drove past someone stranded in the cold. So I turned off my car, stepped out into the biting wind, and felt the sleet immediately soak through my coat as I walked toward her, knowing without fully knowing that this choice would change everything. "Let me take a look," I heard myself saying, though every sensible part of me knew stepping out of my car meant surrendering any hope of arriving at that party looking put together. The freezing rain slapped against my face the moment I opened the door, soaking through my coat like it was made of paper. I felt my hair, hours of careful curling, begin to collapse under the weight of sleet. She stood off to the side, watching without panic, her silver hair glittering with ice. I bent over the open hood, my breath clouding in the cold, and felt for a second like Arthur was right there beside me. He'd taught me the basics years ago, saying things like, "You never know when you'll need this, Joe." And here I was, decades later, hearing his voice as I traced my fingers along the corroded terminals. "Your battery's the problem," I called out, raising my voice over the howl of the wind. "Terminals are corroded." She frowned, and I heard myself ask, "Do you have any cola in the car?" The look she gave me was priceless, half disbelief, half curiosity. "Cola?" "Coca-Cola cleans corrosion," I explained. "Emergency trick my husband taught me." Without hesitation, she reached into an elegant handbag that probably cost more than my monthly rent and produced a small bottle. I unscrewed the cap with frozen fingers, the fizz hissing into the storm, and poured it over the battery. It felt absurd. Two women in formal clothes crouched over an engine in an ice storm, Coke bubbling down the metal like some backwoods science project. She tilted her head. "You're going to ruin your dress." I gave a short laugh. "Already am." Sometimes you have to help people, even if it means getting a little dirty. We waited, the storm swirling around us, the cola eating away the rust. She studied me as if she was collecting evidence, her blue eyes assessing every move. Finally, she asked, "Where are you headed, dressed like that?" I almost lied, but the truth slipped out. "Christmas party, my son's in-laws. Very formal." She raised an eyebrow. "And you stopped to help a stranger?" I shrugged. Family events happen every year. Leaving someone stranded in this weather, that would sit with me forever. Something shifted in her face at that moment, the faintest crack in her composure. Approval, unexpected, quiet, but real. "Try it now," I told her. She slid into the driver's seat, turned the key, and the engine purred to life like nothing had ever been wrong. For the first time, she smiled, warm, genuine, the kind of smile that lights a person from the inside. "You're very kind," she said softly. "Not many people would have stopped, especially dressed for a party." I looked down at myself, coat soaked, skirt smeared with grease, hair plastered to my scalp. The elegant woman I'd practiced becoming was gone. "Well," I sighed, trying to sound light, "I can't exactly show up like this. Maybe I should just head home." "Nonsense," she said firmly, a steel edge in her voice. "Anyone worth knowing will understand that you put kindness before vanity. And if they don't, they're not worth knowing." Then, with the grace of someone who'd been rehearsing this moment for years, she reached into that expensive purse and handed me a card. Embossed letters shimmered faintly even in the storm's dull light. Rose Montgomery. My breath caught. My son's wife's grandmother, Kate's grandmother, the matriarch herself. Her eyes met mine, blue but warmer than Kate's ever had been, and I could swear there was a flicker of satisfaction there, as if she'd been waiting for this exact encounter. "I am indeed," she said with quiet certainty, "and you must be Joan Harrington, Mike's mother." The way she spoke my name, like she had known it long before I opened my mouth, sent a chill through me that had nothing to do with the storm. She paused, her sharp blue eyes fixed on my shocked face, as though she was testing how I would hold her gaze. I've been very curious to meet the woman who raised such a good man. My thoughts scattered like startled birds. This is Rose Montgomery? The same woman Kate had described as detached, someone who had supposedly stepped away from family affairs, letting Charles handle everything? The one I had pictured as a distant figure sipping tea in another room while the family conducted their business? Standing in front of me was no frail grandmother. This was a woman who radiated quiet command, the kind of authority you didn't have to announce. I must have stammered something incoherent because she smiled faintly, like she understood my confusion. "I'm quite sure you didn't realize," she said, her voice carrying layers of meaning I couldn't begin to untangle. Then she gestured toward her car. "Shall we head to the party together? I think you'll find it more interesting than you expect." I followed her taillights up the winding road, gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles whitened. The absurdity of it struck me all at once. I had spent days rehearsing conversations, shopping for the right dress, practicing how to hide every trace of where I came from. And here I was, trailing behind the matriarch herself, soaked, stained, and entirely exposed. After all that preparation, all that worry about appearances, I was about to arrive at the Prescott's mansion not polished, but painfully, unmistakably myself. As we crested the hill, the estate came into view, glowing against the storm like something out of a movie. Strings of white lights traced every arch and window, casting a golden glow on the icy branches. Through the tall windows, I glimpsed elegant figures moving from room to room, crystal glasses in hand, laughter spilling out faintly into the night air. My old sedan looked like a rusted toy compared to the line of luxury cars idling under the grand portico, their valets moving briskly in pressed uniforms. My stomach clenched. "This is it, Joan. No more mirror rehearsals, no more pretending." The moment we pulled up, two valets rushed forward. One opened Rose's door with a surprised expression, his breath visible in the cold. "Mrs. Montgomery, we weren't expecting you for another hour." His tone carried both respect and relief, as though her sudden appearance shifted the air around the place. Meanwhile, another young man hesitated before reaching for my car door, his eyes flicking briefly to my muddy tires and dented bumper. I climbed out, water dripping from my coat onto the polished stone drive, painfully aware of how I must have looked next to Rose's elegance. She stood tall, unbothered, her presence filling the space, while I tried not to shrink into the shadows. And for the first time that day, I wondered if maybe my messy, bedraggled entrance wasn't an accident, but exactly the way Rose wanted me to arrive. When we pulled under the glowing portico, Rose stepped out first, unruffled despite the storm. A valet hurried toward her, bowing almost, blurting, "Mrs. Montgomery, your driver called to say the roads were too dangerous." She adjusted her coat as if this were nothing at all. "I decided to drive myself," she said simply, her tone flat and final, then glanced back as another valet approached my battered sedan with thinly veiled confusion. That explained why she'd been stranded. Her driver had abandoned the trip, but Rose Montgomery wasn't the type of woman to miss her own family's gathering. Meanwhile, I climbed out of my car, the sleet still dripping from my coat hem. When I stepped into the foyer, I caught a glimpse of myself in the massive gilt-framed mirror. My lipstick was mostly gone, my hair limp and clinging in damp strings, grease streaks staining the burgundy fabric I had once been so proud of. Under the brilliant light of a crystal chandelier, there was no hiding what I was: disheveled, out of place, exposed. "Rose!" A voice rang out from the staircase. It was Beth Prescott, gliding down each marble step with the practiced elegance of someone who'd spent a lifetime rehearsing entrances. She stopped abruptly when she spotted me at Rose's side. "And Joan," she added after the briefest pause, her smile taut. "How unexpected." She drew out the word unexpected so that it meant exactly what she intended: unfortunate. My cheeks burned, but before I could shrink back, Rose's voice cut across the tension. "Joan helped me with car trouble," she said smoothly, almost casually, quite resourcefully, actually. The simple statement carried weight, as though she were making a declaration no one dared contradict. From the parlor, Kate appeared in a shimmer of silk and sequins, her dress easily worth more than my monthly pension. She was glowing until her gaze fell on me, and then her smile stiffened like wet cement. "Oh my goodness, Joan," she said, the sweetness in her tone as brittle as glass. "What on earth happened to you?" I opened my mouth to answer, but I didn't get the chance. Mike came rushing forward, his face etched with a mix of concern and embarrassment. His eyes flicked from my soaked coat to my ruined hair, and I saw the war inside him: love for his mother, dread of what his wife and in-laws must be thinking. "Mom, are you okay? You look like you've been in an accident." I forced a laugh, though my throat felt tight. "I'm fine, honey. I just stopped to help someone with car trouble." The room fell quiet for a moment, and I felt every eye on me, like I was a piece of furniture that didn't belong in their curated design. To me, it was simple. I'd done what anyone with a conscience would do, but here, under their chandeliers and polite stares, kindness looked like clumsiness, generosity looked like weakness. I stood dripping on their polished floors, my dignity hanging by a thread, while Rose remained beside me, her presence steady, unflinching. For reasons I couldn't yet name, that steadiness kept me from running back out into the storm. Kate's voice sliced through the air, sharp with irritation. "You could have called AAA," she said, emphasizing each letter like I was a child who'd missed an obvious solution. "Now you'll need to freshen up before meeting everyone." Her words echoed against the polished walls as we stepped into the grand parlor. The chatter that had filled the room only moments before evaporated. Dozens of eyes turned toward me, Austin's polished elite, draped in silks and tuxedos, staring at the bedraggled figure who had somehow wandered past the invisible velvet rope. I could feel the heat of their judgment like spotlights. Every raised brow, every half-hidden smirk landed squarely on me, confirming the very fear that had knotted in my chest all week, that I would be judged, dismissed, erased before I even had a chance to prove I belonged. Kate leaned toward Mike, her whisper designed to be overheard. "David, this is embarrassing. Everyone's staring. Maybe she should just go home and change. Come back later." The words stung more than the cold wind outside. My son shifted awkwardly, his mouth opening but no words coming. Before he could speak, Charles Prescott stepped forward, his posture commanding, the room bending subtly to his presence. He wore authority like a tailored suit. "Joan," he said, his tone coolly polite, the kind of politeness that feels like a door being closed in your face. "How good of you to join us. Though perhaps you'd be more comfortable if you left to get cleaned up. We'd completely understand." The message was clear. I wasn't welcome as I was. Maybe I wasn't welcome at all. Shame surged hot in my cheeks, and for a moment I considered sparing everyone, including myself, the discomfort. I opened my mouth to excuse myself, already imagining the quiet drive back to St. Paul, replaying this humiliation alone in my apartment. But before I could get a single word out, Rose's voice cut through the silence like the crack of a whip. "Actually, Charles," she said, her tone deceptively mild, "I think everyone should hear about Joan's good deed before she changes clothes." Her voice carried a weight that commanded attention. The rustle of conversation stilled completely, and even the waiters froze mid-step, sensing the shift in the room's air. I stood frozen, stunned by her intervention. Rose didn't raise her voice, but her calm authority carried further than a shout ever could. People leaned in, curious, waiting. The humiliation burning in me dulled slightly, replaced by something I couldn't quite name. Was it relief or fear of what she might reveal? My dress was ruined, my hair flat, my shoes pinching painfully, yet suddenly all eyes weren't just mocking. They were listening. Rose Montgomery, the matriarch who everyone assumed had long retreated from family matters, had just placed me at the center of the room. And whether I wanted it or not, the next moments would define everything that came after. After all, kindness is so rare these days. Rose's voice floated through the grand parlor, calm but firm, the kind of voice that makes people lean in whether they want to or not. That was the moment it struck me. She wasn't going to let this room swallow me whole. She was about to flip my humiliation into something else entirely. Straightening her posture, her silver hair gleaming under the chandelier, she addressed the crowd with the ease of someone born to command attention. "Joan didn't just stop for car trouble," she said, her words echoing across the marble and velvet. "She sacrificed her appearance, her dignity even, on the very night of this party to make sure I wasn't left stranded on an icy road. That kind of character deserves recognition, not shame." I stood there, dripping sleet onto their priceless Persian rug, feeling exposed, raw, like a specimen under a microscope. But for the first time that night, I wasn't only an object of ridicule. Rose wasn't finished. Her piercing blue gaze swept the room, cutting through the clusters of silk dresses and black tuxedos. "How many of you would have stopped?" she asked, her voice deceptively soft, as though she already knew the answer. "How many of you, faced with the choice between helping a stranger and preserving your perfect image, would choose the former?" The silence that followed was suffocating. No one moved, no one spoke. Champagne glasses froze halfway to painted lips. In the corner of my eye, I caught Kate's expression twisting, like she'd bitten into something rotten. She didn't need to say a word. I could see how much she hated being forced into this spotlight, her carefully curated world cracking under her grandmother's words. "Mother," Charles Prescott began, his tone edged with warning, but Rose lifted one elegant hand, silencing him instantly. "I'm not finished, Charles." The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees, the weight of her authority pressing down on everyone present. For the first time all evening, I realized this gathering wasn't just about cocktails and polite conversation. It was a stage, and Rose Montgomery had just taken control of the play. She turned back to me, her expression unreadable. "Joan, would you mind telling everyone exactly what you did?" My stomach clenched. Every eye in the room swung back to me, expectant, unblinking. Part of me wanted to disappear into the carpet, to let the silence stretch until it swallowed me whole. But another part of me, the part that remembered Arthur teaching me to hold my ground when life pressed too hard, urged me to speak. My voice shook but carried across the room. Her battery terminals were corroded. I used Coca-Cola to clean them, an old trick my husband taught me years ago. A ripple of disbelief and muffled laughter rolled through the room, as though the notion of cola fixing anything was the most absurd thing they'd ever heard. But Rose didn't laugh. She nodded slowly, her eyes never leaving mine, and for the first time that night, I felt less like a punchline and more like a participant in something larger than myself. Part of me wanted to melt into the floor, but another part, stubborn, almost defiant, was curious to see where Rose was going with this. My voice trembled, but held steady as I said, I used Coca-Cola to clean the corrosion off her battery terminals. My late husband taught me that trick. Years ago, a ripple of murmurs swept through the parlor, punctuated by a stifled laugh from somewhere near the fireplace. Rose repeated the words, her tone thoughtful, deliberate. Coca-Cola. She let the syllables linger, turning them from a punchline into something else entirely. Practical knowledge applied without hesitation to help someone in need. No concern for clothes or appearances, just action. She moved closer, standing beside me now, and I realized that at 78 years old, she still commanded the room in a way no one else could. That, she continued, her voice calm but laced with steel, is exactly the kind of thinking that built this family's fortune. The willingness to get your hands dirty when something needs fixing, that's where true strength lies. Kate stepped forward then, her smile brittle, her eyes flicking nervously between me and the crowd. Grandmother, perhaps we should let Joan get cleaned up before... But Rose cut her off, her tone still pleasant but edged with finality. Before what, Catherine? Before she makes us look bad? A hush fell again. Rose's gaze swept the room. I think Joan looks exactly like someone who puts helping others before herself. That's quite beautiful, don't you think? For the first time in 3 years, warmth bloomed in my chest, where only cold dismissal had lived before. Someone in this family wasn't just tolerating me. They were standing up for me. Rose pivoted smoothly, her authority unchallenged. Now then, she said briskly, I believe Joan deserves to enjoy this party, just as she is. After all, authenticity is far more valuable than artifice. Charles Prescott cleared his throat, his discomfort obvious. Of course, Mother. Joan, please, make yourself comfortable. His words were polite, but his eyes betrayed the calculations racing behind them. He knew better than to openly contradict Rose. The matriarch's approval was currency more powerful than any business deal. Around us, the guests began to murmur again, conversations resuming. But now their glances at me had changed. Less derision, more curiosity. A woman in emerald silk leaned toward her husband and whispered, not unkindly, as though I'd just become an unexpected character in their carefully staged play. I whispered a quiet thank you to Rose, still reeling from the shift. She smiled, and for the briefest moment I caught something in her expression. A glimmer of satisfaction, almost as if this had been her plan all along. My dear, she said softly, we're just getting started. The next hour blurred into a surreal haze. Word of her public endorsement spread through the party like wildfire, and suddenly people who'd avoided eye contact earlier were now seeking me out. They introduced themselves, shook my hand, and leaned in eagerly as I retold the story of the freezing rain, the dead battery, the Coke fizzing over metal in the storm. With every retelling, the shame I'd carried began to dissolve. The same story that had ruined my dress was now winning me respect. How resourceful, gasped a woman dripping in pearls worth more than my car, her eyes wide with admiration. For the first time since Mike married into this family, I felt the faintest flicker of belonging. I wouldn't have known the first thing about car trouble. I turned to see Mike at my side, his hand hovering near my elbow like he wasn't sure whether to steady me or pull me out of the room. His brow was furrowed, his concern genuine, but there was something else too. Puzzlement. Maybe even pride. Mom, are you sure you're okay? You don't have to stay if this feels uncomfortable. I surprised myself with my own answer. Actually, I'm having a lovely time. And the strange part was, it was true. The weight of humiliation had lifted, replaced by the warmth of Rose's support. Your grandmother-in-law, I added, lowering my voice, is quite remarkable. Mike's expression softened. She's always been sharp. I've tried to tell Kate that Grandmother Rose isn't as uninvolved as she pretends. She notices everything. Hearing him say it made me feel lighter, like maybe I wasn't crazy after all for sensing the same. Kate drifted over then, her face composed like porcelain, but her eyes betrayed annoyance. Grandmother can be very protective of people she takes a liking to. Her tone made it sound like a warning, more than reassurance. Before I could respond, Rose's clear, steady voice carried across the room, silencing conversations as easily as a bell. "Joan, come with me. There's someone I'd like you to meet." Heads turned as she gestured me forward, and I felt the invisible shift of attention follow me again, not mocking this time, but curious. She led me toward a tall man in his early 60s, silver at his temples, posture so straight it spoke of discipline. "This is Stephen Adler," Rose said, her hand resting lightly on his sleeve, "our family attorney and longtime friend." "Stephen, this is Joan Harrington, the woman I was telling you about." He extended his hand, warm and firm, and smiled in a way that reached his eyes. "Rose has been singing your praises," he said. "She tells me you have excellent instincts for solving problems." I nearly laughed, bewildered. "I just helped with a car." "That hardly counts as instincts," but Stephen shook his head. "Sometimes the simplest solutions are the most elegant." His tone carried weight, as if the conversation wasn't just about cars at all. Rose glanced at him, and in that glance I caught something. A whole conversation passing silently between them. Something about strategy, trust, maybe even legacy. I stood there, damp hem brushing against my ankles, certain I was missing something important. My instinct screamed that this wasn't casual flattery. Rose was positioning me somehow, though for what, I didn't yet know. Before I could ask, a butler's voice rang out. "Dinner is served." We moved toward the dining hall, and when the doors opened, I nearly gasped. The room could have held my entire apartment twice over. Crystal chandeliers scattered light across polished mahogany, silver gleamed at every place setting, and china so fine I was afraid to touch it lined the table. I slipped into my seat, heart pounding, acutely aware that whatever this evening was turning into, it was no longer just about surviving humiliation. It was about stepping into something I didn't yet understand. I hadn't expected to be seated anywhere important, so when I found myself placed between Rose Montgomery and a gracious older gentleman introduced as a retired ambassador, my pulse quickened. The ambassador smiled warmly, and before I could even find my napkin, Rose lifted her glass slightly and addressed our end of the table. "Joan helped me today," she said, her voice carrying with ease over the clink of silverware. She demonstrated the very kind of practical wisdom and selflessness that built the foundations of success. My face flushed, but I held still, aware that half the room had tilted an ear to listen. The ambassador's wife leaned toward me, her pearls glinting in the chandelier light. "How wonderful," she said earnestly. "It's so refreshing to meet someone who actually does something helpful instead of only talking about it." A ripple of agreement passed through those nearby, and suddenly I wasn't invisible anymore. Rose kept me in the conversation as the first course was served, her questions thoughtful, almost strategic. She asked about my small volunteer projects back in St. Paul, about how I'd helped at the local church pantry, about Arthur's old carpentry business. For the first time in years, I felt like my words carried weight, like my experiences mattered to someone in this room. When I told the story of how Arthur had taught neighborhood kids woodworking, building birdhouses, fixing broken chairs, showing them how to measure twice and cut once, Rose nodded with a kind of reverence. "Frank sounds like he was a remarkable man," she said softly. "That's legacy, Joan. Passing on skills, helping others succeed, that is the kind of wealth that endures." Her words stirred something deep in me, something I'd almost forgotten about, the pride of what Arthur and I had built together, even if it was never gilded with money. But across the table, I saw Kate shifting uncomfortably, her eyes darting toward her father. Charles's jaw tightened a fraction more each time Rose praised me, the muscle working in quiet irritation. I realized then that something was building beneath the polite conversation, like a storm brewing behind closed doors. Kate's forced smile grew thinner, her champagne glass clutched a little too tightly, while Charles's silence became heavier with every compliment thrown my way. The ambassador laughed at one of my stories. His wife asked me about my favorite books, and yet I could feel the Prescott family bristling at Rose's deliberate spotlight. This wasn't just dinner anymore, it was theater, and I was being pulled into a performance I hadn't auditioned for. When dessert plates were cleared and coffee cups placed before us, Rose leaned back with that air of unhurried authority and announced, "Shall we move to the library for coffee and brandy?" A murmur of assent followed, chairs scraping, and my heart pounded as I rose to follow her. Whatever was about to happen, I sensed that the true purpose of this evening was only just beginning. The library took my breath away the moment we stepped inside. Floor-to-ceiling shelves lined with leather-bound volumes, the faint scent of polished wood and old paper hanging in the air, deep leather chairs arranged around a fireplace so large it could have swallowed my entire living room back in St. Paul. Above us, oil paintings of grim-faced ancestors gazed down from ornate frames, their eyes seeming to follow every movement. Rose leaned toward me as she lowered herself into a massive wing-back chair that looked more like a throne than a piece of furniture. "This," she whispered with a faint smile, "is where the real conversations happen." Her words sent a shiver through me. This wasn't dinner theater anymore, this was the boardroom cloaked in family trappings. The group that followed us in was smaller, more selective. Charles and Beth Prescott settled near the fire. Kate perched on the arm of a sofa with Mike beside her, looking torn between loyalty and dread. A few family friends lingered near the bookshelves, sipping brandy as though they were extras in a play, pretending to browse but really listening. And then there was Stephen Adler, the family attorney. He chose his seat carefully, angled so he could observe everyone without seeming obvious. Something about his quiet vigilance made me certain I was about to witness more than polite conversation. "Mother," Charles began, his voice careful, measured, "it's been a lovely evening, but perhaps the business reports could wait until tomorrow." He didn't get far. Rose's tone sliced clean through his words. "Actually, I've already reviewed them." She leaned back, one hand resting on the carved arm of her chair. Quite concerning, I must say. The look that flickered between Charles and Kate was sharp enough to make my stomach clench. I didn't know what was going on, but I knew enough to realize I was sitting in the middle of something raw and real, far bigger than holiday small talk. "The company is doing well," Charles said quickly, defensively, as if rehearsed. "Profits are strong, restructuring has been effective. We've secured growth." His voice carried the weight of numbers, but not conviction. Rose's reply was calm, almost gentle, and yet it struck harder than a shout. "Financially successful, yes, but tell me, when was the last time Prescott Industries contributed meaningfully to the very community that built its success?" Her gaze shifted to the portraits above us, then back to her son. "When was the last time we remembered that this company wasn't founded on luxury, but on responsibility?" Charles's mouth tightened. "Community relations are expensive overhead." Rose rose slowly from her chair, moving toward the firelight, her shadow stretching across the room. "It's not overhead, Charles," she said firmly, her hand resting on the gilded frame of a portrait. "It's responsibility. And the moment we forget that, we lose the very foundation on which this family name was built." The painting above the fireplace caught the light as Rose stepped closer. It showed a woman in her 40s, dressed simply but with undeniable elegance, her gaze steady, her posture unyielding. I blinked. She had Rose's bone structure, the same piercing blue eyes that seemed to weigh and measure everyone in the room. "This is me," Rose said, her voice calm but carrying. "In 1969, the year I started Prescott Industries with a $5,000 loan and a rented storefront in downtown Austin." For a heartbeat, silence settled so thick you could almost hear it crackle. My eyes darted between the portrait and the woman before me, my mind struggling to reconcile the polished grandmother with the fierce young woman immortalized in oil paint. "I was 23 years old," she continued evenly, "a young mother with bigger dreams than anyone thought sensible, and I was told over and over that women couldn't build businesses, not serious ones, that I should be content to raise children, keep house, and leave the future to the men." She let the words hang for a moment, letting the weight of history sink in. Instead of listening, I decided to prove them wrong. Kate's face had drained of color, her lips parting in disbelief. "Grandmother, what are you saying?" she whispered. Rose didn't flinch. "I'm saying that I built this company from nothing. Every contract, every expansion, every success came from my vision, my decisions, my willingness to work 18-hour days when no one else would. I solved problems others wouldn't touch, and I turned those solutions into opportunity." Charles shifted uneasily in his chair, adjusting his cufflinks as though they could anchor him against the tide rising in the room. "Mother, we all know you were instrumental in the early days," he said carefully, like someone walking across thin ice. Rose's gaze snapped to him, sharp enough to slice through the air. "Not instrumental, Charles. Foundational. I didn't help build Prescott Industries." Her voice dropped lower, but carried more power for it. "I am Prescott Industries." I felt a shiver run up my spine. The force of her truth filled the room like fire, undeniable and scorching. She turned slightly toward the portrait again, her hand brushing the gilded frame. "Your grandfather Harold was a wonderful husband, a devoted father, and an extraordinary teacher. But he was not a businessman. He didn't create this empire. I did. And somewhere along the way, you—" Her eyes flicked to Charles, then to Kate, then across the silent onlookers. "Forgot what it was built on. Not just profit margins, not appearances, not empty prestige, but work, resilience, the courage to get your hands dirty when others won't." Her words hit like thunderclaps in the quiet library, each syllable dismantling decades of polished myth. And I sat there, soaked hem brushing against Persian rugs, realizing that for the first time in my life, I was seeing the truth behind the Prescott name. The business success came entirely from my work. Rose's words landed like stones dropped in still water, sending ripples through every corner of the library. Then her gaze shifted, locking on me, and I felt my breath hitch in my chest. "Joan reminded me today of who I used to be," she said slowly, her voice steady, deliberate. "Who I still am beneath decades of allowing others to take credit for what I built. Someone who solves problems. Someone who helps others, no matter how it looks." My stomach tightened. This wasn't just about family lore or polite after-dinner conversation. This was about power, legacy, and a dynasty that had let itself forget where it came from. And suddenly, I realized that Rose Montgomery wasn't just Kate's grandmother. She was the founder, the architect, the source of everything, and she was about to make sure everyone in that room remembered it. "You built the company yourself?" I whispered, barely trusting my own voice. The pieces were finally clicking together in my mind like a lock turning. "Not your husband. Not anyone else. You." For the first time that evening, Rose's smile softened into something real. "Smart woman," she said, nodding. "Yes, I built Prescott Industries from scratch. Harold was a wonderful man, a loving husband, but the business was mine, entirely mine." The silence was so complete I could hear the faint crackle of the fireplace. Kate's face had gone white, her lips pressed thin. Mike looked bewildered. "But everyone always said it was Grandfather Prescott's vision," he murmured, his voice thick with confusion. "The founding tradition, the family legacy." "I let people assume Harold had built it," Rose replied, her tone practical, matter of fact, as if explaining the weather. "Because in those days, a woman running a company was treated like a sideshow." Suppliers doubted me. Clients dismissed me. Banks made it nearly impossible. It was easier, safer, to let Harold be the face, while I did the work that turned $5,000 and a rented storefront into an empire. She let her words hang in the air like smoke no one could clear. Across from me, Charles's face shifted from pale to flushed red, anger simmering just under the surface. "Mother, you can't just—" He faltered, and Rose cut him off sharply. "Can't what?" "Tell the truth about my own company? Remind this family that everything you enjoy, every car, every chandelier, every dinner served on fine china, came from the sweat and vision of a woman who refused to quit?" She stepped behind me then, resting one elegant hand lightly on my shoulder, her presence steady as bedrock. "Today," she said, her voice ringing through the room, "Joan demonstrated the exact qualities that built this fortune: practical problem solving, willingness to sacrifice, character over appearance. Those qualities once defined us, and now they've been forgotten." Kate bristled, finally finding her voice. "Grandmother, this isn't fair. We can't all be automotive repair experts." A brittle laugh flickered around the room, but Rose silenced it with a glance. "It isn't about car batteries, Catherine," she said, her tone patient but firm. "It's about values. When you're faced with a choice between helping someone in need and preserving your own comfort, which do you choose? That's the measure of character." Her words settled over the room like a heavy blanket, pressing down on everyone. And as I sat there, I thought of every snub, every polite dismissal, every time I had been made to feel like a burden. For the first time, those experiences weren't just my private shame. They were part of the indictment Rose had just leveled at her entire family. "Isn't it?" Rose's eyebrows arched as her gaze swept across the room. "When was the last time any of you invited Joan to something beyond obligatory holidays? When did you last ask about her life, her work, her interests?" Her words landed with precision, and for once it was my son, not me, who looked cornered. Mike's face was pale, his mouth tightening as he murmured, "I tried, Grandmother." I encouraged more inclusion, but Rose cut him off, her tone soft but unyielding. "But you let it slide because confronting it was uncomfortable. That may be human nature, Michael, but it is not acceptable. Families, like companies, rot when we avoid the hard truths." Her words struck me deeper than I expected. For the first time, my son was being held accountable, not just as a Prescott son-in-law, but as my child. She moved deliberately to the massive mahogany desk in the corner, the kind that looked like it belonged in a presidential office. From a drawer, she drew out a thick leather folder, its edges worn from handling. "Stephen has been helping me prepare for this conversation for months," she said, nodding toward the attorney, who remained impassive but alert. "I've been planning to resume a more active role in the company's direction." The air in the room shifted. Charles shot to his feet, outrage simmering. "Mother, this is unnecessary. The company is running perfectly well." Rose's answering smile was cool, almost cutting. "Financially, yes, but ethically, number. We've become exactly what I feared most, a business that prizes profit over people." The room erupted, voices rising at once, Beth muttering to a family friend, Kate whispering furiously into Mike's ear, Charles demanding explanations. But Rose raised one elegant hand, and the noise collapsed into silence. Her gaze found me, steady and sharp. "Joan." My name in her voice felt heavy, like it had suddenly been written into stone. "I have a proposition for you." My stomach lurched. Surely I had misheard. But she went on as calmly as if she were announcing dessert. "I'd like to offer you a consulting position with Prescott Industries, Head of Community Engagement and Values Implementation." For a long, breathless moment, I thought I might actually faint. Me, Joan Harrington, the woman who clipped coupons, who cut her own hair, who had spent the past 3 years being treated as a second-class guest in this family, being invited into their empire. My fingers gripped the arm of my chair, my voice caught in my throat. Around me, faces registered shock, horror, disbelief. Kate's mouth fell open. Beth's eyes widened, and Charles's jaw clenched so tightly I thought he might shatter his teeth. Only Rose looked serene, her expression one of satisfaction, as though she had finally placed the missing piece in a puzzle no one else could see. And sitting there, soaked and brushing the rug, my heart pounding in my chest, I realized she wasn't just offering me a job. She was handing me a lifeline, a role, and a measure of power that could no longer be ignored. "We'll start with a 6-month trial at $75,000, with the potential for a permanent executive role if things work out." I swear my jaw actually dropped. I wasn't the only one. Across the room, faces reflected the same stunned disbelief. 75,000 wasn't astronomical by their standards, but to me it was life-altering. More than I'd made in years, more than I'd ever dreamed of. My lips parted, but words stumbled out in fragments. "Rose, I don't understand." She regarded me with calm clarity, as though the answer were obvious. "It's simple, Joan. Prescott Industries has lost touch with the values that made us successful. You understand people. You don't wait to be asked to help. You solve problems without complaint, and you treat everyone with dignity, regardless of status. That is exactly what this family needs to relearn." She opened the thick folder she had placed on the desk earlier, sliding out a stack of documents. The papers looked crisp and final, the kind of contracts that could shape lives. "I've been planning this restructuring for months," she continued, "but I needed the right person to anchor it. Today confirmed what I hoped, that you have the instincts and the character to help me implement it." My hands trembled in my lap. A day ago, I had been clipping coupons and praying my car's heater didn't fail. Now I was hearing the matriarch of a Texas dynasty talk about me like I was a cornerstone. It was dizzying, surreal. "This is insane," Charles exploded, his voice cracking through the air. He sprang to his feet, face flushed, hands clenched at his sides. "Mother, you can't just create positions out of thin air because someone can pour soda on a car battery." His words sliced, cruel and dismissive, and for a flash my old shame tried to claw back in. But Rose's gaze snapped to him, cold and sharp enough to freeze water mid-stream. "Sit down, Charles," she said quietly. The authority in her voice left no room for argument. "This is not about car batteries. It's about values, something you, in your obsession with profits, seem to have forgotten." The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the faint crackle of the fire. I sat there, caught between disbelief and awe, my pulse hammering in my ears. Kate's face twisted, torn between outrage and fear, while Beth pressed her lips together so tightly they blanched white. Mike stared at me like he didn't quite recognize his own mother anymore. For so long I had been invisible in this family, tolerated only because of him. Now, in a single evening, Rose had dragged me into the spotlight, framing me as both example and solution. And while part of me wanted to shrink back into the shadows, another part, a stronger, louder part, was starting to wonder if I might actually belong in the light after all. "Charles," Rose said, her voice slicing through the library like a blade, "under your leadership, employee satisfaction has collapsed. Our presence in the community has vanished, and charitable giving reduced to the bare legal minimum. That is not what I built." Her gaze shifted to me, and suddenly it felt like every eye in the room followed. Joan represents exactly what we need to restore those values, she said firmly. She opened the folder on the desk, her fingers resting on a stack of crisp documents. This position would mean forging community partnerships, overseeing our responsibility programs, and helping bring humanity back into the culture of Prescott Industries. You would work directly with me, at least in the beginning. My head spun. 6 hours earlier, I had been worrying about whether I'd fit in at a Christmas party, and now I was staring at an offer to help steer the soul of a corporation. But I don't have any experience in corporate consulting, I blurted, heat rising to my face. Rose's reply was immediate, her voice calm but edged with steel. You have experience in what matters most, caring for people, solving real problems without worrying about appearances. Those qualities can't be taught in business school. Skills can be learned. Character cannot. Kate finally spoke, her voice strained, her posture stiff. Grandmother, this is very sudden. Perhaps Joan needs time to think. Her eyes flicked to me, cool and warning, as if daring me to back down. For a moment, my old instincts surged, to shrink, to apologize, to retreat from the spotlight I never asked for. But before I could lose my nerve, the words slipped out. Actually, I'd like to accept. The trial position, at least. My voice sounded steadier than I felt, but in that instant, it was like I had broken through a wall I'd been staring at for years. Charles's face darkened, the muscle in his jaw working as though he were chewing back rage, and finally it spilled over in clipped words that filled the library. This is outrageous, Mother. You bring in an outsider with no corporate background, and suddenly she has a seat at the table. You undermine me in front of my family, in front of our friends, in my own home. His voice carried the sting of entitlement. Each syllable meant to push me back into silence. But before I could even absorb the attack, Kate joined in, her voice sharp as broken glass. Grandmother, this is humiliating. How do you think it looks? Parading Mike's mother as some savior. She doesn't understand our world. She doesn't belong in it. And everyone here knows it. The words hit hard, but for the first time in years, I didn't feel myself shrink. Mike shifted uncomfortably beside her, torn in two directions. He reached for my hand under the table, his palm clammy, his eyes searching mine with desperation. But I could see he wasn't ready to fight his wife or his father. For a long time, that would have crushed me. The silence of my own child. Tonight, though, Rose's hand still rested on my shoulder like an anchor, and the weight of her presence gave me something I hadn't had in years, the courage to speak without apology. I didn't ask for this, I said, my voice even but steady, but I also won't apologize for being chosen because I showed the values your family claims to honor. You've told yourselves for years that appearances matter most, but appearances don't keep people warm. They don't put food on the table, and they certainly don't build loyalty. The room went still, as if every person there had forgotten how to breathe. Kate's eyes narrowed, her face twisted with indignation, and Charles slammed his glass down on the desk so hard the brandy inside splashed over the rim. You think you can walk in here and lecture us? He snapped, his voice cracking in fury. You've lived on the fringes, scraping by, and now you presume to tell us how to run a company that has stood for half a century? For once I didn't flinch. Yes, I said simply, the single word carrying more weight than a speech. Because scraping by teaches you what truly matters. Because when you don't have layers of wealth to cushion you, you learn what people need. And if you're blind to that, then maybe you're not fit to lead the company your mother built. The fire snapped in the hearth, sending sparks upward as the silence stretched until it was unbearable. I could feel every gaze on me, some shocked, some curious, a few quietly admiring. Kate looked as though she might scream, Charles as though he might erupt again, but neither moved, because Rose was smiling. A small, knowing smile that told me This was exactly the moment she had engineered. For the first time since setting foot in that house, I felt something stronger than fear, stronger than shame. I felt power, not the kind that comes from money or position, but the kind that comes from standing firm when you're expected to bow. And in that moment, I knew I had crossed a threshold I could never step back from. "Joan," Rose said, her voice carrying the kind of quiet power that made even Charles fall silent. "You've reminded me tonight that true wealth is not measured in financial statements. It is measured in the lives you touch, the people you help, and the good you do with the resources entrusted to you." The words seemed to vibrate through the library, settling into the dark wood paneling and the very bones of the house. Standing there in my stained burgundy dress, shoes ruined from ice and grease, I realized something profound had happened. I wasn't just being defended in front of the Prescotts, I was being recognized for something far greater than social standing. As I looked around the room, I saw stunned faces, but also flickers of curiosity, even respect. I felt the weight of my own journey, years of loneliness, of trying to squeeze myself into spaces that didn't want me, and suddenly it all crystallized into meaning. Rose Montgomery, the woman who had built an empire with her own hands more than 50 years ago, had seen something in me that I had nearly let slip away. She didn't see just the bedraggled woman who stopped to help with car trouble. She saw someone who could extend that instinct to a much larger stage, someone who could help bring humanity back into a family and a company that had lost its way. For the first time in years, maybe decades, I felt not like an outsider begging to be included, but like a woman standing firmly where she was meant to stand. The library that had once seemed intimidating, its portraits, its chandeliers, its air of judgment, now felt almost welcoming, as though the walls themselves acknowledged my place there. I no longer measured myself against Kate's silk gowns or Beth's garden club chatter. I was measured instead by what I chose to do, by the difference I could make, by the values I carried that no amount of money could buy. When I left that night, stepping back into the storm, the air felt different, charged with possibility rather than dread. I wasn't just leaving as a tolerated guest who had survived humiliation. I was leaving as a woman with a new purpose, a partner to Rose in rebuilding something meaningful. Tomorrow, I would begin the most unexpected and important work of my life, not to prove myself to the Prescotts, but to prove that values like compassion, resilience, and dignity could still reshape the world, one deliberate act at a time. And if you've been listening to my story all the way to the end, I'd really love to hear what you think. Have you ever felt like an outsider in your own family, or had a moment where you finally stood your ground and found your voice? Share it down in the comments because I read them all and your stories matter. Don't forget to hit that like button if this story touched you, and make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next chapter. We've got plenty more twists and turns ahead.